At my retirement party, my own son told me I was no longer welcome in the house I helped him buy. I smiled, I stood, and I left without saying a word. That night I didn't cry. I didn't scream. But something inside me broke quietly, and what followed even I didn't expect it would shake everything he thought he owned. The toast should have been a moment of pride. I was retiring after 4 decades in public health with people from the department, old colleagues, even a few community leaders all gathered at Felix's home. He raised his glass, thanked me for my years of service, and added a warm line about legacy. Then came the sentence that changed everything. We can now start the next chapter in our own home. There was a pause, not in him, but in the room. I looked at Marla. She didn't meet my eyes. Her hand gently rested on Felix's arm, but she wasn't smiling. She looked at the floor like she had something in her shoe she couldn't shake loose. The guests clapped. Toasts followed. Cake was served. Someone even gave me a book of quotes about aging gracefully. But I heard nothing else after that line. My name was still on the mailbox, but the way he said it, I knew he had already erased me from the picture in his mind. A new chapter. Their own home. It wasn't the first time I had been talked over. Women like me, widows over 60, calm in the face of chaos, know how to stay quiet. We've spent years doing it. I smiled, nodded through photos and laughter, accepted a bouquet of lilies I'm allergic to, and even posed for a picture by the garden shed with the new banner that read, "Happy Retirement, Mum." When the last guests left, I stayed to help clean up. I picked up paper cups and stacked folding chairs while Felix and Marla talked to the caterers. No one stopped me. No one insisted I rest. And I realized something strange. I wasn't even mad. I was empty, like a room after the furniture's been taken but before the dust settles. Later that evening, sitting alone in the guest room, the same room they had recently begun referring to as the nursery for their future plans, I stared at the half-packed boxes labeled Mum's stuff. I didn't remember packing them. That night I didn't sleep. I kept replaying the moment, his voice so smooth, so proud, like it was an honor for me to be let go. Like stepping aside was something I should be grateful for. You ever hear something that knocks the wind out of you without even touching your body? That's what it felt like. A sentence spoken softly, but it landed like a closing door. Maybe some of you listening have felt that too. That moment when someone rewrites the story you thought you were still part of and doesn't even notice they left your name out. I didn't cry that night. I just sat in the dark shoes, still on purse, still in my lap. And when the sun rose, I stood up, quietly walked to the garage, got in my car and drove away. I left the lilies on the kitchen counter. I figured Marla might like them. I drove south without checking the map, letting the road choose for me. My hands stayed firm on the wheel, but my chest felt hollow. There was no plan, no overnight bag, just my purse, a half-empty thermos, and the weight of everything left unsaid. By noon, I stopped at a rest area just outside Eugene. I parked in the farthest spot behind a row of tall pines. The gravel crackled beneath my tires. I tilted my seat back and stared at the ceiling of my car. The sky outside was clear. People walked their dogs. A couple kids threw chips at crows. Life was normal everywhere but inside me. I didn't cry, not because I was brave, but because I was too stunned for emotion. My brain was still trying to understand the gap between what was said and what it meant. Felix had spoken so gently, so kindly, but underneath the words was something final. As dusk fell, I didn't turn back. I couldn't. I filled the tank at a gas station with flickering lights and kept driving, pushing past Medford until the road signs began to feel familiar. That was when I remembered Ashland. Years ago, Everett and I bought a small place there. We called it our someday house, a quiet corner lot with a wraparound porch and a chimney that always needed attention. He wanted to retire there. We planted an apple tree the first spring. I hadn't visited since he passed. I pulled into the drive just after midnight. The porch light was still there, its glass chipped. The yard was wild with weeds, but the house stood like an old friend waiting patiently. I unlocked the door with a key I hadn't used in over a decade. The hinges groaned. Dust floated through the beam of my flashlight. I dropped my purse on the floor and sat down right there in the entryway. The wood was cold beneath me, but it was mine. I listened to the silence. It didn't feel empty. It felt honest. That night, I slept on the old couch in the den with a blanket I found in the hall closet. No pillow, no heat. But I slept through until morning. When I opened my eyes, sunlight filtered through cracked blinds and fell across the wooden floor. And for the first time in days, I felt like I could breathe. I made coffee with a stovetop pot we kept from the early days. The kitchen smelled like dust and cinnamon. The cupboards still held a few chipped mugs. One had Everett's initials in faded Sharpie. Standing at the sink, I looked out the window toward the apple tree. It had grown wild branches, sprawling in all directions. The fruit was small, dark red, some already fallen in the grass. But it had survived. So had I. I didn't know what would come next, but I knew I wouldn't go back to being invisible. The house in Ashland wasn't part of the plan Felix had written. That was fine, because for the first time in a long while, I had a plan of my own. The third morning in Ashland, I climbed up to the attic. The pull-down ladder creaked under my weight, but I knew exactly where I had left things. I hadn't been up there in years, but Everett and I had always kept our most important records tucked in a metal filing cabinet beneath an old quilt. The quilt still smelled like cedar. I pulled open the drawers one by one. Our marriage license tax returns from the 80s, faded Polaroids of Everett holding Felix as a baby. Then I found the red folder marked Deed and Will, EH. It was right where he had placed it before the cancer took over. Inside, I found the original property deed for the Ashland house. Everett had bought it in his name, but had amended the title before he died, making it my sole asset. It was signed and notarized, stamped with a thick blue seal. Under that was the last will and testament he'd drafted, clear and simple. The Ashland home was to remain mine, not ours, not Felix's, mine. A strange calm swept over me. Not anger, not triumph, just the quiet knowledge that at least something had been protected. Everett had known what this house meant to me, to us. I kept sorting slower now. That was when I noticed a different folder, a thin manila envelope labeled Durham Equity Group. I didn't recognize the name. Inside was a loan document for a business line of credit secured against a property listed under my name. My name, but with a signature that was not mine. The handwriting was close, but I knew my own loops and slants. This one was too tidy, too young. I sat back on the floor. The page felt heavy in my hands. It didn't take long to figure out what Felix had done. I found copies of emails he'd printed out, sent to a man named Jared, someone listed as a financial advisor. In one message, Felix described plans for a senior wellness startup and noted that additional equity from my mother's primary residence had been secured. Another email detailed the transfer of documents, including a signed authorization form from me. He had forged my signature. Felix had used my house in Portland to finance his business. A business I knew nothing about. A business that apparently wasn't doing well based on the frantic tone in his messages. I took a deep breath and laid everything out in front of me. The will, the forged documents, the contact list Everett had kept, including the number for a lawyer we used years ago in Salem. There was no time for crying, no use in shock. My name had been used without consent. My home was collateral in a debt I hadn't agreed to. I stood up slowly and began gathering the papers into a fresh binder. I labeled it in block letters, IH, Legal Review. Downstairs, I cleared the dining table, spread out the files, took photographs of each document on my phone, saved backups to a flash drive. I worked like someone preparing for a deposition, because in a way I was. This wasn't about getting back at Felix. This was about reclaiming what should never have been taken. I wasn't angry at him yet, but I knew that time would come. For now, I moved with precision, like the public health official I used to be. Facts first, then the remedy. That morning, I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table in the Ashland House, papers spread before me like a quiet battlefield. The copy of Everett's will lay flat, held down by an old brass paperweight shaped like a stethoscope, a gift from my public health team the year he passed. I kept tracing his signature with my eyes. There was something grounding about it, real, undeniable. I needed someone who understood what came next. Not just legally, but emotionally, too. I thought of Alison Bishop. Years ago, she was just a quiet intern in my department. Bright, unsure of herself, always taking notes, even when no one asked her to. I remembered how she stayed late, helping with a community vaccine clinic when most of the staff had already left. I hadn't spoken to her in more than a decade, but I'd seen her name in a local article recently. Something about representing older clients in elder abuse and financial exploitation cases. I found her law office's number and called. The voice on the other end was clear and alert. She remembered me right away. There was a pause when I explained briefly what I'd uncovered, but then she said calm and firm, "You did the right thing by calling." That same afternoon, she made the 2-hour drive down from Eugene and met me at a diner near the edge of Ashland. She arrived in black boots, a wool coat, and that same notepad still clutched in her hand. The waitress poured her coffee. She barely sipped it. Alison listened more than she talked. I laid out the forged deed transfer, the equity loan papers, the documents Everett had left. She took notes, nodding slowly. Then she closed her notepad and looked me square in the eye. "This isn't just a case of mistaken paperwork. It's a breach of fiduciary trust, elder financial abuse, and potentially fraud under Oregon law. But it's also personal. Very personal." I didn't answer. I just breathed. She offered to review everything that night. No charge. Said she had seen too many mothers who were erased by legal tricks forced into silence. Her own grandmother had been pushed into a nursing home after her son sold her house without permission. I saw something tighten in her jaw when she said it. Back at my house, I handed her the manila folder marked with Everett's handwriting, the one with the original property deed for Ashland, listing only my name. That evening, while she worked at the small writing desk by the window, I reheated soup and set out 2 bowls. The rhythm felt familiar, like I had not been cast out of a family, but had stumbled into a smaller, sturdier one. She stayed overnight, slept on the pull-out couch, her laptop humming beside her. The next morning she handed me a checklist: revoke any existing power of attorney, file a quiet title action to secure Ashland, consider a revocable trust to protect all future assets, prepare a forensic review of all transactions involving Felix. "Start small," she said, "but stay steady." I walked her out to her car and stood for a long while as she drove away. The air smelled like cold pine and melting frost. I looked down at the papers in my hand. One page was folded neatly with a pink sticky note attached. "You've already done the hardest part. You saw what they didn't want you to see." There wasn't anything flashy about that sentence, but it cracked something open in me. Not sadness, not rage, clarity. And for the first time in days, I slept deeply knowing I wasn't alone in this anymore. The next morning, I pulled open the blinds and let the light into the living room. Ashland's sky was still half asleep, a blend of fog and soft grey. But I wasn't. I felt sharper than I had in weeks. My hands still trembled slightly, but now it wasn't from fear. It was anticipation. I sat with Alison's checklist again, each line item like a rung on a ladder I had no choice but to climb. The first step was filing paperwork to revoke the power of attorney Felix had forged. She would handle that, but I needed to supply the original documentation: birth certificate, proof of identity, marriage certificate, Everett's death certificate, and that one letter he wrote me a year before he passed. I had kept it folded inside an old cookbook, right between recipes for strawberry preserves and buttermilk pie. I gathered everything and placed it into a red plastic file folder. Then I printed a fresh label for it. In black marker, I wrote IH, clean start. After that, I drove into town and walked into a supply store that smelled like rubber and cardboard. I bought more folders, highlighters, and sticky notes in 3 colors. Back at the house, I sat on the floor of the guest room, now my makeshift office, and organized every document into categories. One folder held everything about the Ashland house. One for Felix's transactions, one for legal letters. And a fourth one, still nearly empty, was labeled Future Plans. Alison returned in the afternoon. She carried a box of legal forms and 2 lattes she said were too sweet but comforting. She showed me where to sign, walked me through what each form did. Her voice was steady, never rushed. Her pen tapped lightly between phrases like punctuation in the air. We submitted the revocation paperwork that same evening through an online portal. Then we began drafting the new structure, moving the Ashland house into a residency trust in my name only. That way, even if I fell ill or was incapacitated, no one could claim or move it again without my explicit instructions. I had spent my life building safety nets for others' public health clinics, education drives, wellness programs for underserved communities. But I'd never built one for myself. Until now. The process wasn't fast. We had to wait for responses from county records, review old property filings, and even order a title search. But the act of doing it, of building something that was mine and mine alone, felt revolutionary. Not grand, just quietly radical. At night, I made tea and sat by the kitchen table as Alison typed at the desk. The clack of her keyboard reminded me of Everett scribbling medical notes on his yellow pads. Sometimes she would look up and explain a clause or a deadline. Other times we said nothing. The silence felt companionable. I caught myself staring at the folder marked Future Plans. It only had 1 item in it, so far a single sticky note that read something good. I didn't know yet what that meant. A garden. A small retreat. Maybe something for women like me, who had once believed kindness was enough to keep them safe. By the end of the week, the residency trust was in place. The Ashland house was protected. The first wave of filings had been accepted. Alison said the court would take time, but she was confident. So was I. There was no ceremony, no applause, just the soft zip of a folder closing and the feel of something being returned, not a house, but a sense of self. I tucked the red folder back onto the shelf between 2 books about Oregon wildflowers and aging gracefully. For the first time in years, I knew which page I was on, and it had my name printed clearly at the top. By the end of that first full week, the house in Ashland no longer felt like a stopgap. It was breathing again, little by little. I had opened the windows in every room, scrubbed out the forgotten corners, and even found an old wind chime Everett once hung by the back porch. I didn't realize how badly I needed to hear something gentle in the wind until it rang again. Most mornings I swept the wooden floor barefoot, let the sunlight pool around my ankles. There was no rush, just movement in tension. I filled the kitchen cabinets with the basics. tea flour oats, peanut butter. I made soup. I sat in the sunroom with a sweater over my shoulders and started rereading books I'd abandoned over the years. That Monday, while I was trimming the overgrown rosemary by the front walk, I heard my phone buzz from inside. It was a text from Marla, just 3 words. Are you all right? No punctuation, no explanation, just that. I stood frozen for a moment, clippers in hand, sap on my palms. Her message could have meant anything. But I read it again slower this time and noticed the absence of Felix's name. She hadn't said we. She hadn't spoken for him. She'd reached out on her own. I didn't answer. Not yet. I wasn't ready, but I didn't delete it either. That night, I lay awake longer than usual. The wind was louder. It scraped at the windows like a whisper you try not to hear. And I couldn't stop thinking about the silence at the retirement party. How Marla had looked down at her shoes when Felix made his announcement. How her shoulders had twitched like she wanted to speak, but swallowed it instead. Maybe she'd wanted to protest. Maybe she'd rehearsed it in her head, but never said a word. I couldn't excuse her silence, but I could imagine its weight. 2 days later, I got another message, this time from Alison. She had finalized the documents for the trust transfer. The Ashland house was now under protection. We were secure. No one could touch it. She added one more thing. A friend of hers at a legal aid clinic was interested in my story, not for publicity, but for insight. They were launching a resource for older women navigating elder financial abuse. She wondered if I'd speak with them someday. I said I'd think about it. I wasn't sure I had anything wise to say yet, but I appreciated that someone believed I might. That same afternoon, I pulled out a dusty radio from the hall closet and set it up by the window. I tuned it until the crackling faded and music filled the room. An old jazz station, soft brass low piano. I stirred lentils and carrots in a pot and let the notes settle into the walls. That evening I sat on the front steps as the sun dipped low behind the trees. I watched the light shift across the wooden porch shadows, long and quiet. I hadn't cried in days. I hadn't raised my voice in longer, but I had started humming again. And the house, like me, had begun to feel lived in, not by memory, but by presence. That mattered more than I expected. In Ashland, spring came gently. The air lost its bite, and the earth began to soften again. The backyard smelled of damp bark and early blossoms. One morning I noticed tiny buds on the Japanese maple Everett planted the first year we bought this place. That tree had outlived both our careers and most of our arguments. Now it stood watch, like an old friend, its limbs quiet but full. I found myself standing at the kitchen window more often watching it. And with each glance, memories surfaced, not loud ones, but the kind that hover beneath daily life. I remembered the years Felix was small and sick, often. The way I'd work double shifts, then come home to check his breathing. The mornings I'd skip coffee to pay for his inhalers. The applications I never sent in for medical fellowships because the timing wasn't right. Or more honestly, because he needed me. I remembered capping our savings to fund his startup, signing off on second mortgages when the first round of investors backed out. Felix never asked with cruelty. He just assumed I would. And I did. Over and over. Back then, it never felt like a sacrifice. It felt like love. It felt like being the kind of mother I wished I'd had. But sitting in this quiet house, watching that tree press upward into the sky, I started to wonder. Had I been generous? Or had I made myself into a resource to be used up? I walked to the hall closet and pulled out a dusty box of old documents. I flipped through years of receipts, loan guarantees, insurance forms with my name scrawled in small corners. My signature lived in so many places, quietly woven into the infrastructure of their lives. invisible, necessary, forgotten. There were cards, too, handwritten ones from Felix over the years. One read, "Thank you for believing in me even when I didn't know what I was doing." Another, "I owe you everything." But the last one I found was from the year he launched his app. It was typed, cold. "Appreciate your ongoing support. You'll see returns soon." I never did. That evening I sat on the porch as the sky turned lavender, my legs tucked under a quilt. I watched the streetlights blink on, one by one, the neighborhood still and sleepy. The cost of being quiet is that no one hears you vanish. You fade in the background. You become the outline that holds others up. But that tree outside my window, it had been pruned too, so many times over the years. Cut back, shaped, tamed. And still it grew, not to please, not to serve, but because it was made to. That night I took out a notebook and wrote a list, not of what I'd lost, but of what I'd done. Each line was a seed, each memory a root. This house would hold more than regret. It would hold a woman learning late, but finally to name her own worth. I didn't plan the email. It came to me one morning right after I folded the last of the laundry and poured myself a second cup of coffee. The air was crisp, and the house was silent but alive. I sat at the table where Everett and I used to do taxes and holiday cards. This time there were no bills to sort, no envelopes to stamp, just me, my laptop, and a clear understanding of what I had left to say. I opened a blank message and typed, "I've reviewed the documents you filed under my name." That was it. No greeting, no closing, no explanation. Just that one sentence, sharp and spare. It was not meant to provoke, only to confirm that I knew. I didn't need to shout to be heard. Silence had its own volume, and that line would echo in him longer than any paragraph of protest ever could. I hit send, closed the laptop, and took a breath that felt like stepping into cold water. It didn't sting. It woke me up. Alison called that afternoon. She said the final filings were complete. The trust was live. The house in Ashland was now protected under my name alone, placed in what she called a residency trust, ironclad against seizure or manipulation. She paused before adding, "You're officially free of their reach now." Those words sat with me like a warm stone in my hand. But that wasn't the end of it. Alison had also finished setting up the second trust, the one I'd asked for quietly weeks ago. It would be called the Harlow Foundation for Displaced Elders. A small start. Modest but specific. A fund dedicated to supporting older women who had, like me, been removed from their homes, often without warning, usually without recourse. Women erased not by accident but by design. The initial capital came from my old saving, what was left from the inheritance Everett set aside untouched by Felix's schemes. It wasn't millions, but it was enough to help someone breathe again. We had a simple mission: emergency relocation support, short-term legal aid, and a list of safe homes for women who found themselves suddenly unwelcome in the homes they'd built. Alison said it might grow. I didn't care if it didn't. What mattered was that it existed. A foundation wasn't about revenge. It was about memory, about making sure what happened to me wouldn't go unnoticed or unlearned. That evening I walked outside and placed my hand against the tree trunk in the backyard. The bark was cool and textured. I whispered nothing. I just stood there. Inside, on the kitchen counter, the printed trust papers sat waiting to be signed. But they didn't rush me. No one did anymore. I moved with the pace of someone who had nothing to prove but everything to reclaim. The woman I had been quiet, yielding, invisible, she didn't vanish. She evolved. She gathered the pieces of herself and made something durable. Something with her name on it. Something no one else could claim. And when the sun dipped low and cast long shadows across the yard, I smiled. Not because I'd won, but because I'd remembered what I was worth. And now it was written down, in ink, in law, in legacy. It was a Tuesday, just after noon, when I heard tires crunching on the gravel outside. I looked up from the porch expecting a delivery, or perhaps Allison dropping off papers. But it was Felix. His car door opened slowly, like even it was unsure of what it was doing here. He stepped out with a hesitation I hadn't seen in years. No confident stride, no clipboard or laptop in hand. Just him, standing in the open hands, stuffed in his pockets like a boy again. I didn't stand up. I stayed seated in the old rocking chair wrapped in the same cardigan I wore the night I drove away. It was thin now, stretched at the elbows, but I liked the way it reminded me of movement. Felix approached the steps, stopped and looked up at me like he was waiting for something. I didn't offer it. I thought I'd check in, he said, finally. His voice was quieter than I remembered. But still there was that tone and undertone of assumption, like the very act of showing up should be seen as goodwill. I rocked once, then again, calm, steady, not angry, not afraid, just no longer small. "This isn't your place to check in on," I said. He blinked. The words seemed to land differently than he expected. He took a step back. I could see it on his face that this wasn't the woman he thought he could manage, the one who folded when pressure came, the one who quietly signed what he handed her. He looked at the house behind me as if trying to figure out how I had managed to rebuild something without him, how I had made it through not just intact, but grounded. "You got my email," I added. Not a question, a statement. He nodded slowly. I did. There was a long pause after that. Not uncomfortable, but unfamiliar. The space between us was no longer filled with mother and son. It was filled with choices, his and mine. He tried once more. "Mum," I held up a hand. Just enough. Not to silence him, but to spare us both the speech he had rehearsed in the car. "You don't owe me words," I said. "Not anymore." He stood there for another beat. Maybe two. Then he gave a small nod and turned back toward his car. No slam of the door, no raised voice, just the sound of gravel again receding. I watched until he was gone, until the air settled again, until the stillness felt like mine once more. There was no satisfaction in it, no triumph, just the knowledge that I didn't flinch, that I didn't need to, that the ground beneath my feet wasn't something he could shake anymore. I walked inside, made tea, and sat with the quiet. It was not empty. It was earned. And for the first time since the retirement party, I felt no weight on my chest, no question lingering in my mind. Only one certainty: I had come back to myself. And I was staying. 3 days after Felix left Ashland without another word, a letter arrived. Not an email. Not a typed document. A real letter handwritten in neat cursive that trembled slightly at the edges. It was addressed simply to Imogen Harlow, with no return address, but the postmark read, Portland. I knew the handwriting. I had seen it on birthday cards, grocery lists, post-it notes on the fridge back when we all still shared one. I opened it slowly. The paper was cream-coloured, lined with a faint floral border, the kind sold in stationery packs from department stores. The ink was blue. The tone was not rushed. Imogen. I don't know if you'll read this. I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. I know I'm probably the last person you want to hear from right now, but I needed to try. I paused. The kettle whistled behind me. I let it. I needed this moment more than I needed tea. Felix didn't tell me everything, but I knew enough. I saw the papers. I saw how fast he pushed them through, how he talked over you at every family dinner, how he framed things like decisions we all agreed on. But I didn't agree. I didn't speak up. And I have no excuse for that. I sat down at the kitchen table, the letter trembling just a bit in my hands. The morning sun caught the edge of the paper, making the ink glisten like it had just been written. You were never a burden. You were never in the way. If anything, you were the only one who ever made this house feel like a home. I think I started losing myself when I started letting Felix speak for both of us. The words slowed down like she had stopped and cried between sentences. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything from you. I just wanted to say I saw what he did. And I see you. I always have. Even when I said nothing. My hands were still, but my chest felt tight. You are the strongest, most dignified woman I've ever known. Everett knew it. I know it. I just wish I'd had the courage to say something when it mattered. The letter ended there. No signature. Just space. Like she didn't know how to end it. Or maybe didn't believe she deserved to. I folded the letter once. Then again, I didn't cry. I didn't get angry. I didn't feel absolution. What I felt was a small release. Like a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying had shifted to a place I could live with. Marla had never been cruel, but she had been silent. And in my life, silence had carved deeper wounds than harsh words ever could. Still, I didn't tear the letter up. I didn't burn it. I placed it inside a manila folder labeled simply Marla. I slid it onto the bottom shelf of my desk beneath the legal documents behind the trust paperwork. Some things don't belong at the center anymore, but they still deserve to be kept. Later that evening, I sat by the window, the same one where the old maple cast long shadows across the room. I thought about all the women I had known who disappeared in their own homes, erased not by rage but by omission, by being slowly talked over, managed, moved aside. And I thought of the ones who had written letters, quiet ones, letters that didn't ask for redemption but offered recognition. That night, I slept without turning once. The house was still. My name was still mine. And even if nothing changed between us, I knew I had heard something I never expected, to the echo of someone finally saying what should have been said long ago. The papers were ready. Alison sat across from me at the long oak table in her office, a stack of documents arranged with precision. The morning light filtered through the high windows, soft and warm, catching in the curls of dust above the floorboards. It smelled faintly of ink and cedar. The room had the stillness of a library or a courtroom, or perhaps both. I adjusted my glasses, looked down at the folder she had labeled the Harlow Foundation for Displaced Elders. The foundation was real now. It had its own federal tax ID, a secure trust, and a mission statement carved out carefully across 3 pages. It would offer legal advocacy, emergency housing referrals, and education workshops for women over 60 who had been displaced or financially manipulated by their own family members. My name was listed under founder and chair. It wasn't something I had chased. It was something that had grown out of the cracks left behind. Alison tapped one page gently. This is your signature page. Once you sign here, the foundation is active. You become the legal steward. I held the pen. The weight of it was ordinary, but the act wasn't. I remembered Felix's voice at the retirement party. That moment he said, "We can now start the next chapter in our own home." How quiet the room had gone. How everyone let it pass as something sweet, even generous. No one had asked where that left me. Now I knew where it left me. Here, in this room. Not erased, but rewritten, by my own hand. I signed, one line, then the next, then the last. Alison smiled. Not big, just enough. We don't always get the last word, she said, but sometimes we get the last deed. That's the better part. I nodded. On the final page, beneath the signatures, was a short paragraph we had worked on together. A kind of dedication. It read, "In honor of the women who were erased quietly and rose even quieter." I asked Alison if I could take a copy home. She handed me a clean folder with everything inside. I tucked it into my leather bag, zipped it shut. There was no parade, no press release, no applause. But I felt something settle in my chest, low and steady. It wasn't pride, it was ownership. Not just of property or paper, but of my own name, my own choices, my own past. Everett would have liked that. He always believed in action without noise. As I stepped outside, the wind picked up slightly. It carried the smell of rain and fresh earth, a reminder that spring was still unfolding, even if winter had overstayed its welcome. That night, I placed the folder on the same shelf where I had once stored my marriage license and Everett's will. I let it rest there, not as an artifact of what I'd lost, but a record of what I had reclaimed. Later, as I turned off the lights and walked down the hallway of the Ashland house, I noticed how quiet it was. But this quiet no longer felt hollow. It felt earned, like something I had shaped, like something that now answered to my name. The porch faced east. Morning light filtered through the old lace curtains and stretched across the wooden planks like a quiet invitation. I brought out my tea and a worn book I hadn't touched in years. The air smelled of lilac and damp soil. It was the kind of spring morning that asked for nothing and gave everything. I had repainted the railing myself last month. The soft grey tone felt neutral, honest, like the space I now occupied in my own life. I sat down. The chair creaked under me the way it always had when Everett was still around. Nothing dramatic, just the comfort of something that still held. In my lap sat a letter. Marla's. I had read it 3 times since it arrived. Her handwriting still tilted left, a little unsure, just like the way she had stood next to Felix that night of the party. She had written that she didn't expect forgiveness, only understanding. She said she had known what he did, but stayed silent because she thought silence would preserve peace. I folded the letter carefully. I didn't tear it. I didn't frame it. I slid it into a red folder labeled Quiet Evidence. Then I placed it back on the shelf next to the foundation's paperwork. I didn't need it near my heart. I only needed to remember it was real. Out on the porch, the wind shifted. A few leaves danced across the stone path. I wrapped the shawl tighter around my shoulders. My name was mine again. My home was mine again. My silence was no longer about fear or shame. It was a space I had reclaimed. I didn't wait for Felix to show up again. I didn't wait for Marla to visit. I didn't wait for the world to call me back in. I had built my own front step, and it would be enough. I had once lived like someone who hoped to be invited back in. Now I lived like someone who had already arrived. If you've ever felt like someone quietly erased your name, your place, or your worth, I hope this story reminded you that silence does not mean surrender. Sometimes walking away is not losing but choosing, and sometimes what you rebuild in peace becomes more powerful than what was taken in betrayal. Tell me, have you ever found strength in quiet decisions or reclaimed something they thought you forgot? You're not alone. Your voice matters, even when it's whispered.